My name's Aaron Mehta. I'm editor-in-chief of Breaking Defense, breakingdefense.com. And I'm joined by three people who are going to be much smarter than me, but I'm just going to try to hang with them as best I can. To my left is Devaki Raj, who is Chief Digital and AI Officer in Strategy at Saab. She spent almost 4 years at Google before leaving to launch Crowd AI in 2016, which was then acquired by Saab in 2023. And I believe you said the origin of that was actually this event at one time?
Yes.
So
we'll talk about it.
That's going to be fun. Next to her is Hugh Zabriskie, who's product manager with their host today at Applied Intuition. Over the course of his career, he's had a number of tech jobs, including with Microsoft and Palantir. And then on the left is Wendy Anderson, who I've known for, we figure out, over a decade at this point, horrifyingly as this time is these days. And she is Senior Vice President for Federal and National Security at Palantir. During her time in government, she served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel and Chief of Staff to then Deputy Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. Before joining Palantir, she spent 2 years at Spark Cognition. So a lot of brain power up here. And what we're going to try to do with this panel is something I think a little different than what we normally get at these events, which is to provide a little bit of optimism as much as possible here. And I should say, by the way, we will be taking questions. Please send those via email to nexus@applied.co, and we'll have a team that's going to be providing those up here on my magical iPad. So optimism. It's a bit of a cliche at this point to say working with the government is hard, right? You know, this is a stunning thing for everyone here. It's too demanding. It's too slow. They don't do change well. If you listen to all these panels, I think the takeaway is, why do we even bother working with the government? It's going to end up either bankrupt or insane. And we want to try to dispel that a little bit with this panel. So to start with, what I think I want to do is ask for, for lack of a better term, your superhero origin story here. What inspired you to work with the government? And maybe we'll start here and we'll just go down the line, because I think Wendy's got the most government experience, so she's, has a little history here. But I think it's really interesting to hear from people who aren't in that world. Why work with the government? Why bother?
Yeah, so my origin story is definitely different. I grew up in a town called Lexington. It was 15 minutes away from Hanscom Air Force Base, but I knew no one whose parents were in the military or were going to go to the military after high school. So it was definitely different. So when I started my company, Crowd AI, again, didn't think I would be building computer vision tools for the military. But in 2016, 2017, when Project Maven was being stood up, DIU actively reached out into Silicon Valley to these two companies like us and said, hey, we are working on something very interesting. Would you come in and pitch? And so I think that was really interesting, in which government reached out into the commercial space to start bringing in companies. And that's where I first started. What kept me there is honestly the people. I've never worked with more motivated, mission-driven individuals than I have worked at the military. So subsequently, kind of we expanded. I just came back from the CENTCOM innovation tour under General Kurilla assembled about 5 CEOs to go around the AOR. And again, I was motivated by how smart and how mission-focused people are in ways you generally don't see in industry. So it was the people that kept me coming back.
People matter, it turns out, even in the tech community. You?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. So my Genesis story started when I switched from Microsoft to Palantir. And at the time, I was kind of looking to be in a more high-impact role, be closer to the customer. And when I applied, just like as a part of the formality, as rolling on, they were like, hey, do you want to get your clearance? Do you want to apply? And I was so naive. I was like, I guess, sure.
And this will be fast and easy.
Yeah, exactly. And they're like, yeah, we're going to do this whole background scan. I was like, well, okay, maybe it's useful later. But I just really kind of stumbled my way into the space from there. So I spent a couple years on the commercial side of Palantir, living abroad, working on a lot of different projects like cybersecurity, finance. But then I once again sort of stumbled my way towards USG when COVID hit. So as some of you may know, Palantir supported the CDC and Human Health Services during COVID, and I was part of that project. And then made my way over to the DoD side and worked on Project Maven. And I just kind of kept stumbling my way towards it a little bit. But as I did, I think I found that, I think very much to Devaki's point, like hearing about mission oriented was something I'd heard as sort of like a recruiting pitch in the Bay, but it felt so real. in DoD. And I thought that was just so inspiring. And the way that people were able to work in like very difficult conditions. Many of you guys know what a skip is like. And, you know, they had other options and they really chose to be there. So I think that was super important. More broadly, I think as I've kind of spent a little more time in this space, there's such a need for technologists to come, I think, to the Hill, to come to DoD and help chart what that future looks like. So I think there's something like in Congress today, 200 of congressmen or businessmen. I think there's about 11 engineers and a chemist. And you know, so kind of bringing some of that talent over is going to be just super important for the future of the department as well.
We miss you, but you landed really well. So congratulations. Devaki, I just wanted to say really +1 to what you said about people. Aaron, in response to your question, there is one word or whatever, which is, for me, it was 9/11. Full stop. I happened to, you know, kind of come of age at the time when that event occurred. And I remember I had studied religion and philosophy. And I thought to myself, well, that'll be lucrative and really interesting. And maybe I'll go on and get a PhD and talk to people about, you know, theology and systems of meaning. But I was really interested in how people were motivated by religion. And of course, this is prior to 9/11. So I spent a lot of time in a lot of different countries around the world, mostly war zones and various, places on sort of the spectrum of conflict, and was with Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, and was in Burundi and Israel and Palestine, and, you know, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Cyprus, Northern Ireland, et cetera, and was just working with a number of NGOs there. And then 9/11 happened. And I thought to myself, you know, I've been living as an American in a lot of different parts of the world as a kind of semi-permanent consumer of American foreign and defense policies, you know? Not that I knew what they would be received as by the population on the ground there, but it was a complicated mix of things, as you can imagine, right? To consume our policies from that side of things. So when 9/11 happened, I thought, you know, I've been all over the world and I don't know what I'm doing here. I mean, it seemed interesting. It seemed important. Maybe it was self-indulgent. I don't know. I was young. But when 9/11 happened, I remember thinking to myself, what are the thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of things and decisions and cultural experiences and information flows that had to happen to result in that day? What had to occur of which that day was an effect? And I was really just taken by that. And I thought, I have never my entire life focused on my own government. I've been hanging out with everybody else, focusing on theirs, or thinking that I had something maybe to offer. I don't remember. But I did know I couldn't believe I hadn't focused on mine. And I thought, you know, I want to be some tiny little part of whatever piece of government defense policy in terms of its, you know, creation, development, communication, execution. And so that for me was the turning point. And I immediately talked with a number of people in DC, and they were like, yeah, you're sort of interesting that you've had this travel, but no one's going to understand you in Washington. They're going to see a religion degree. They're not going to get it. Maybe you ought to go back and actually, you know, do something that has relevance to make you competitive in kind of this amazing talent ecosystem in DC. I've been single-minded and very laser-focused since that time. I feel like I still am, even though we clearly are in a transition period post 9/11, yet maybe to be determined, although we know some things, and didn't know that I could find so many of the similar elements in this part of the private sector, not selling technology to our adversaries, wanting to work with the United States government, especially supporting our military, and especially supporting national security agencies and the national security objectives of the country, and also have a mission focus. And I knew I'd find that in government. I did. I'm very proud of that service. I got to work with Ash Carter, who was all about this day and all about how do we continue to keep the United States technologically superior. And I think that's when the tech piece, as the game changer, in this century became so important to me to figure out how to manifest in my own life. Palantir has been the answer to that. There are so many different answers, but it was 9/11 full on.
So you mentioned Ash Carter, and in 2015, 2016, when he was Secretary of Defense, his big push very much was on the tech side, setting up things like Defense Innovation Unit, the DIB, other kind of tech efforts. In a lot of ways, when you look at the headlines now, and as a reporter, certainly we're guilty of doing this too. You still get a lot of, well, it's always hard to break into the tech community for the Defense Department. Tech community doesn't want to work with defense issues, national security issues. And I've started to get the sense, and I'm probably about 2 years behind everyone in this audience, but I think that's an interesting point, that that's simply not as true as it was in 2015, 2016, this mindset that people in the tech community don't want to work with Defense Department at all. I'm wondering, and maybe again we can go down the line, Devaki, we can start with you, but have you seen improvement in the way that's not being captured in this idea or the headlines of, oh, well, tech companies don't want to do defense. They don't want to work with the U.S. government at large, but especially on the defense side?
Yeah, so we decided to work with the Department of Defense fairly early on. This was around the time when Google pulled out of Project Maven. So we did have to deal with that narrative. The way our company dealt with it, Crowd AI, was we primarily worked on a lot of national mission initiatives, so wildfire, infrastructure, and things like that. So we were able to kind of skirt the issue of working on defense applications for a few years. But then as we started to hire people with military backgrounds, actually one of the people that we hired is now currently the CDAO at CENTCOM, Mike Foster. We realized that we can't just be on both sides or either side. So we put together a document of these are the things that we're willing to work on, these are the things that we're not willing to work on. So it's really about creating those boundaries. And also in the interview process, bringing it up in the interview process, this is what we work on, this is what we're going to continue to work on, is this the place for you? So that's how we personally dealt with it as a Silicon Valley company. In terms of macro side, I think it comes 2016 through, I think, 2018, 2019. Yeah, I think it was still very difficult to find Silicon Valley companies willing to work in this space. Then you see companies like Anduril show up, in which their whole narrative from day one was that. So they didn't necessarily need to skirt the issue. They were we're 100% going to be focused in the defense space. Where I think things turned were most recently was probably the war in Ukraine, right? And I've seen that it's more okay to speak about working in defense and supporting Ukraine than it was, prior to obviously the war in Ukraine. Are things changing? I don't know. Originally when I was going to come into this, I was like, yes, the thesis has changed. But if you look at the companies that are still supporting from the Silicon Valley perspective very outwardly, they're almost pure defense companies. So they've chosen from their DNA to start in that space. So I have yet to see, Silicon Valley companies that started in, purely the commercial take that kind of very strong route versus it being a portion of their portfolio. But again, that's just, that's one opinion, but, I would like to see more of it.
That's interesting. What do you think would change that? Or do you think it's become already now bifurcated where there's just a defense tech community and there's the non-defense tech community? I'm just going to have you solve all the problems right here on stage. It's fine.
No, I think that, frankly, the continuing resolution probably put it back slightly behind, because then the companies that decided, hey, I think it's time for us to do dual use. We really want to be part of the wider, the wider military or slash defense space. The continuing resolution, I think, changed the narrative slightly to the negative, because a lot of people who thought they were going to be closing some contracts didn't. And so now that it's now that we're beyond that point, it still is taking time for that money to trickle down. I think that kind of recorrected what could have been much stronger for the defense space.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Having worked at Palantir, which is a defense company first, and then moved into commercial, and Applied, which is a commercial company that moved into defense. And of course, we see companies on both ends of the kind of pure spectrum of that. I think it's such a very deep ecosystem. And one thing as a product manager I spend a lot of time doing is looking at all the other companies that are around there. And I can't tell you how many different approaches that we see, whether we're kind of looking at a, like MLOps perspective or simulation perspective. People have taken so many different approaches. I would say definitely the number of companies has grown, particularly since Ukraine. I would agree. There's the kind of, is defense tech in a bubble right now, but certainly is there an explosion of interest. I would actually just give a lot of credit. Actually, you were mentioning DIU to the government side in terms of progress over the last few years. I mean, DIU has had a near like 6x, more than 6x increase in its funding in the last year. So I think it's almost $1 billion now in budget. FY24, I think it's going towards 1.3, and that's a huge jump given spending caps overall on the defense budget. I think that's a huge signal. I think the department votes with its budget, and it's saying we're really going to invest in mature commercial technology. And I think back to the DARPA Grand Challenge, where a lot of autonomy kicked off. And so what is going to maybe DIU is going to be in a position to kind of launch the next set of those with challenges and competitions and acquisition pathways. So CDAO would be the other one I would call out. So I think to your point, headlines, you kind of see one increment at a time, but if you kind of look at CDAO, which is the progression from what the Jake was doing, which had elements, a lot of overlapping connection with Project Maven, that's 3 generations now of real depth and towards bringing joint services together, having joint programming, figuring out ways to bring data together and tooling together and getting things out of silos. So I would just give a lot of credit actually to the government side in terms of innovation towards that.
Wendy?
Yeah, I look, there are a lot of great examples. I mean, these two just mentioned a number. I was thinking about, how I would sort of think through this. And there's sort of a very traditional, and I personally think kind of boring answer, even though it's really important, of talking about OTAs and how they came into existence and enable, acceleration of sort of alternative defense contractors. There's the software acquisition pathway that, the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment and that office has really put forward, which is to say, hey, 4 years ago, we introduced this element prioritizing software, saying our entire acquisition system in the Department of Defense is really geared towards hardware, right? And so let's actually put some things into play that enable and accelerate. I would note, and I love the department. I am one of the biggest fans of the department and feel that therefore I can criticize with great, frequency. Recently there was this little special operations team put together to now find ways 4 years later to make the software acquisition pathway go faster. So these are the things that happen in the department. They're real. People aren't sitting around hanging out saying, let's waste time. There are a lot of incredible humans who are in the midst of pretty terrifically monumental challenge sets and real problems, trying to make things work and pushing on things every single day. And I always want to recognize that, both from the civil servants, obviously the uniformed military, and also our political appointees. But it is hard. It is just really hard. And it is sort of, it's a little bit like a street fight every day. I could run through some of those things. I'm sure the audience is super sophisticated about everything that kind of, the tools that could assist them now as they think about founding their own company, or as you think about, as an early stage founder, the kinds of opportunities you have. I wanted to make 2 quick points, though, and Devaki started this. I have to tell you, having started with Ash Carter in then USD acquisition technology and logistics, there were so many things that came his way from Defense Secretary Bob Gates to try to solve massive existential kind of crises that we were in the midst of because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm sure Tony Thomas remembers these things very, very well, where, the same vehicles you had in Iraq, you really didn't function in Afghanistan, right? So you moved to MRAP. So you had an MRAP task force that surged the capacity on production and deployment, et cetera. You had the IED task force because so many of our troops were being, killed or living with lifelong injuries still. So there were these interesting things that Ash set up that Bob Gates basically said, the country's at war, the department is not, especially your part. So get with it. Those things were super interesting. They I think, worked for the times that they worked. But those were the beginning little seeds of like what ultimately became ASH and a whole community's worth of department leaders thinking that concretized into DIUX, right? So those were the really interesting kind of, in my view, experimental times where Bob Gates and ASH said, we got to get out of our own way. There is no way that we can actually address the problems that we're having unless we're talking to our military commanders, unless we're working with the COCOMs, unless we are, civitzing in on a daily or at least several times a week with our folks on the ground to say, you're operating in this. We don't want you to die, number one. We want you to be protected and come home. And we also want to make sure and protect you while you are out there. It's warfighter focused. It was operator focused. And that really was his, Secretary Carter's, of course, obviously, Secretary Gates, number one objective every day, had a little card in his pocket, and it said, I get up and support the warfighter. And so DIUX really came out of, of course, there were many things that happened, but came out of that. Since that time to now, the change in Silicon Valley, I barely recognize it. And I'm one person too, right? Devaki said, I'm just one person giving my view. I think mostly they are open for business. They want to get engaged in the defense mission. They want to be committed in a demonstrable way to the national security objectives of the country, and they're trying to find ways to do it. Of course, there'll always be folks who don't want to do it or whatever, but I think it's been a huge transformation in the last many years. And I'd make one other point, Aaron, and I'd be interested in knowing what my colleagues think about this too. I don't even know if what I'm about to say is a controversial statement anymore, because sometimes I have no clue, and I don't care actually if it is, but I'm interested in knowing what you all think about it. I think companies, startups, scale-ups, our ecosystem, right, should take sides. And I think if they're going to do that, then they need to be really clear about what the consequences are. I know, and I can only speak for Palantir, right? I can't speak for another company in the room. The founders of Palantir decided 21 years ago, we're not going to sell technology to the Russians. Seems prescient now. We're not going to sell technology to the Chinese because of everything we know about what the Chinese essentially would like to do with us. And of course, the Iranians and the North Koreans. That's pretty interesting, especially now, right? And it's not like there's been a wavering of those decisions over time. There has not been. So I am always of the mind that companies that are being founded now ought to take a side or consider, what do I stand for? Who do I want to represent? What do I want to be behind? Is it civil liberties? Is it democracy? That's a complicated word, but let's just put it out there because we're in one. What side do I want to be on? And I was talking with Alex Karp, our co-founder and CEO, the other day, and he made an interesting point, not about that. He said that a number of times, which I found personally meaningful because of Palantir. But he said, Apple still invests hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in China. Okay. It would be really interesting to actually have a conversation, I said to him, and have some journalist ask Tim Cook or any other technology company that is still engaged in China and simply say, why are you still there? Now, granted, it's the second largest market on the planet. It's a tough thing to pull out of. We didn't pull out. We never went in. So it's not that I don't think it's a complex situation, but I do think that founders, co-founders should ask themselves, if I take a side, what side am I taking? What am I committing to? How do I keep that as a consistent commitment? And then what do I deal with as consequences for the business?
If anybody in the audience has thoughts on that, please email them to nexus@applied.co. That's actually a good transition point, Wendy, because I think one of the things that we wanted to get at is the question of how do you make sure you're a cultural, but also like a literal product and market fit when talking to the government. And that's a two-part thing, because it's, do you have an actual product that fits the government? You're not trying to just sell them something that doesn't fit their needs, but also how is your own company fit culturally with the government? And then as a kind of follow on that, do you react to that by trying to hire more government folks? Is there a cost benefit of you bring too many people in from the military, suddenly you turn into your processes all look like DoD's processes, which I think everyone can agree is not necessarily the ideal situation for every issue. And how do you kind of maintain your mindset, but also make that work with the government? And Hugh, maybe we'll start with you on this one as somebody who's came to the government part kind of later in your career.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so it's a great question. And the decision to move into defense for applied preceded me a little bit, but it's been cool to see that growth. And my role at the company is really to kind of also figure out what products we should be building. So product market fit is very top of mind for us. It's a very interesting question because I think there's not just product market fit, but there's also like team market fit in the sense of you need to have the right team, the right expertise to go after a specific problem. So as an example, we were in, I was in Poland last week for the NATO Ukraine forum that was going on. It was hosted by DIU, and it's one of the things that's just so clear, I don't think it's news to anybody here, is that UAS and counter UAS are just absolutely such a focus for the group. Now, as you're sitting there, you're kind of thinking, wow, there's about like 8 different things I'd love to help with and to kind of get into, but what are the ones that are a fit for you, right? Given your background, given what your team has, there are paths to approaching those problems in a joint way, which is teaming. We could definitely talk about teaming. There's, of course, acquisition paths that companies take as they grow too. But I think team market fit is a huge piece. Like, do you have the expertise to go after a problem? Because especially in government, it's such a deep, vast system with so many different operations going on and workflows, and they're not so obvious from the outside. So you need the right team to understand the problem. In terms of product market fit, dual use has been a key part of what's made, I think, Applied successful, what's made Palantir successful. Foundry started on the commercial side, but it's had a lot of dual use application. I think that's grown a lot over time. So finding ways to be useful on both sides is absolutely essential. And I think second, this is maybe more general, but I'd say as you're starting new products, one thing that a friend of mine said to me, coming out of Y Combinator, actually, they were just getting started, but I thought it was so prescient, which is as you're finding new product market fit, find the thing that for your customer or for your user is the number 1 or number 2 problem they have. It has to be absolutely urgent. It can't be something that they're like, I'm interested in that problem. It has to be like, they're going to stop your demo and say like, how do I get that deployed right now?
Yeah, so I think that product market fit for startups is an incredibly evolving process, right? You don't start a company, and often you see in Silicon Valley people start a company because they have an idea or they have a technology, and I think this is what leads to this larger issue of how do you become a defense tech company, right? So if you start building a product or based off of a technology that you think commercial is going to use, then kind of transitioning into government is a very difficult task. What I think Palantir has done extremely well. So when I was in CENTCOM, we were in the AOR, and what Palantir has done is put field deployed engineers on the ground sitting right next to mission owners. There were no other pieces of software that I saw, and we went to 4 different bases that had what you guys did have. And I think that's what makes Palantir really successful. So I think when you think about product market fit with the government, I do think you have to come at it with a different perspective, because you can't fit necessarily a technology you've built, apples to apples. And there are legacy systems. Everybody says, product market fit is, very complicated with the government. But frankly, it's complicated with a lot of legacy tech companies. My company worked with Anheuser-Busch. We worked with Honeywell. These companies also had very legacy systems that you had to figure out how to pull data off of these hard drives that sit in non-internet connected factories in the middle of Georgia. And so that problem isn't very different from what the government has. So it's really about, do you have not only just a technology that one is unique and can be valuable, but do you have the team that then can integrate it into legacy systems? And often startups come in and say, I have this really cool software, this really cool technology that could 10x whatever you're doing. But ultimately, if you don't understand that the customer can't just use it off the shelf, then you're back to square one. So I think product market fit in general is a tough problem if you're selling to legacy companies. And so you need to have some form of service enabled deployment, or you're selling a software with a piece of hardware on, which we definitely learned as a startup is a hard lesson. Selling software is quote unquote easier, but selling software plus hardware is an easier, quote unquote, easier buy. So it's a difficult one. It's like this weird matrix of things to do and not to do.
Can I throw that back to you? I'd like to dig in on that a little bit because, of course, I'm curious how Crowd AI started, how you were figuring out that in like the earliest stages of starting a company. Like what was the technology? What was the place you were going to kind of first dig into?
Yeah, I started with something cool. I was like, let me do something really hard. Let's build a computer vision company in 2016 and decide to sell to self-driving car companies, right? So I decided to do the cool thing. And then I realized that, how do I make money? So that's when we started figuring out, okay, well, we need to start selling, computer vision services to companies that need it because they already have imagery. But that's not a scalable product. So then we're like, okay, all this research that we have done for the last 2 years, let's make this into a no-code platform that we can deploy and that anybody could use regardless of background. So we didn't sell to tech companies. We sold to companies that don't have computer vision teams, don't have AI teams, don't have data science teams. And then that morphed into, okay, well, this software, is it going to be deployed on a piece of hardware that sits on a server? Or is it going to be deployed so people can access it via the internet? So then we had two sets of types of customers. And so we really had to kind of, every time we met with a different customer, we had to kind of pivot slightly to fit the narrative that they needed.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think Applied started in the automotive space maybe because that's really where software-defined, we talk about software-defined force, but software-defined systems, vehicles that's where the interest was. That's where the funding kind of went into that space. I think a lot of people think of self-driving cars, but a huge part of Applied's business is actually the what we call level 2 autonomy, ADAS space. So you'll probably see on some sign 18 of the top 20 OEMs are our customers. Those aren't. We're not. It's actually like automotive, like automakers.
Not all of us could be as forward-thinking as Caster.
True. And so, I think as we look to defense, it's actually, in many ways, our commercial business, frankly, our technology is so subsidized by commercial and has continued to be that way. It's always someone at, the General Motors of the world, the Toyota of the world, that's pushing the boundaries of the product. And then, a lot of these other industries, maritime to construction, mining to defense, are picking up from that.
I was only going to footstop one thing. I mean, this is such an interesting conversation that could take us off in multiple directions, but products really have to solve real problems, right? I mean, so wherever there is a pain point, something that makes life easier or an institutional something easier or a war plan doable, or it's got to solve a real problem. And I think, I appreciate Devaki raising this. I was like, wow, this is awesome. You know all about Palantir. And so I, could let you take that on. But I think one of the things we have gotten right, amidst, by the way, getting 1,000 trillion things wrong over 21 years, and I'm happy to talk about any of those, is that we really have always started with the end user. What is the problem? What really is the pain point? And we just sit there and we deploy those software engineers or whatever, and they iterate over and over and over, truly side by side, and often out in the field, out on the edge, in extremely challenging circumstances. And I think that is one thing that we have now had hundreds of thousands of reps in for 20 years and know how to do it. And I think we also now have the credibility over time of making sure that we've communicated to folks. That is something that we can do and maybe do better than anyone else out there because of the reps and because of the lessons learned that have been metabolized in the system. We go in somewhere and literally we just constellate around a problem. The structure doesn't pre-exist for us and we don't superimpose it on anybody else, right? So that's sort of I would say it's one of the enduring things that's been true from the beginning and is still true today.
We have a couple of questions that have come in, which we'll get to towards the end. As a reminder, that's nexus@applied.co. Teaming was mentioned. I think you brought it up. And in our call prepping for this, it was a topic that everyone kind of got energized by. So I do want to make sure we touch on this because Devaki, when we were talking in the lead up to this, was talking about teaming and said, if I may paraphrase you here, we got really screwed over by a teaming deal once. And that was just something we had to accept the risk of because teaming was the only way to get into where we needed to go. I'm not going to ask you, unless you want to go into the details of that, but it's an interesting idea of teaming in this community. What does teaming really look like? I think a lot of people assume in some ways that's, a small tech company teams with Lockheed Martin, but teaming amongst other companies in this ecosystem. Is that a good way to move forward with working with the government? And as I said, is it kind of just an acceptable risk that you have to take to get there?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to think about it. As a small software company, right, you have the option of getting SBIRs, right? So there's like $1 to $2 million, and if you get a StratFi, that's great, but probability of program of record and things like that is fairly low. So that's one way to get in. That's one way to get your foot in the door, and whether it's via DIU or kind of the general SBIR program, right? There are avenues. The other side is if you want to get on those 25 to 100 million, size contracts, multiple year programs of record. Frankly, the only way to do it is to team with a larger partner whose name is well known. So there is a risk, right? So you have to talk about like this core IP that you're building. You have to talk, and often they'll pressure you into exclusive agreements, right? So there's often very little negotiation that can happen, and you can negotiate depending on like where you are, what percentage of the contract needs your technology. But ultimately, yeah, it is something, the risk that you take in order to ideally bring your name out there, tie it with the known program record. So then when you go out for the next set of contracts, you could say you worked on that very known program of record and you're an established player. So there's pros and cons. I do think that it is worth it. For us to say, hey, we're on things like Project Maven was incredibly helpful for us as a small company. We got press out of it. Obviously we continued to get contracts out of it. So, and we still currently work at Saab, with NJ on that. In parallel though, I do think now that I'm on the other side at Saab, it is extremely helpful to team with companies, right? Because Saab has got these exquisite pieces of hardware. How do we bring software from a wide variety of startups that work very quickly and then can integrate a lot of different sensors on pieces of hardware that we built? So I do think that teaming works both ways, and there is value as a sub and a prime. But there's going to be, as a prime, you're going to lose portions that you ideally can get, and there's one very key, like the Sapphire program. I encourage you guys to look at through the entire life cycle of the Sapphire program. There's, it's pros and cons, but on the other side of it, as being part of a larger company, it's extremely useful. So you can see both sides.
It's actually, I just realized we kind of have it nicely set up where it's kind of small, medium, large in this ecosystem here, not, just coincidental. Hugh, I guess want to just go down the line.
Yeah, sure. I think of like Applied Intuition as not Palantir size, but it's a fairly
large
big company.
Not a small
Series,
company,
but the defense arm operates a little bit like closer to a Series A company. It's a very small team, very nimble. I think as I think previous panel was pointing out, accelerating the software force, really hard problem, and bringing autonomy to the DoD, really, really hard problem. And so I think teaming will be so essential to solving autonomy in the DoD space, solving this problem, because everybody's going to bring a different component to this world. Because the companies like us that are dual use, we're solving a very particular set of solutions in the commercial space. The ones in defense will look a little different. And so we need to figure out kind of how we partner. So how do we bring our software and partner with a hardware company? How do we bring model developers and bring them onto our platform? I think it's such a key part. I think the flip side of that is the requirements actually, I think, have to loosen. So I will like kind of
the government requirements.
The government requirements, yes. And General Rainey, who was at the SCSP AI Expo not that long ago, made a really good point about this. He said, the less requirements you give, the better options you get, which I thought was a really interesting point. Like if you give a more open canvas, I think commercial companies will actually figure out how to combine, how the crowd AIs and the Palantirs and Applieds of the world can, find that mix and match and kind of look at that sort of problem statement and see where to come together. And he actually went even further and said the DoD needs to get out of playing the integrator role. Right. So instead of trying to say, I can figure out exactly where all the puzzle pieces, the lines of the puzzle are, I'm just going to let that be a more natural process. And so, I guess I see teaming being a very key component of that. And I think Applied has done quite a bit of teaming and been successful for it, but I think all of Devaki's points still absolutely stand in terms of that hierarchy that comes with teaming.
I'm not sure we've always been good at teaming or at partnering. Anybody who knows Palantir might laugh now. But I'll tell you, we're really getting better. We are. And in an authentic, real way. I mean, look, for the first however many years of company, we would sort of do the soup to nuts, right? And we didn't really need anybody else. Maybe it would have been more successful or something if we had done that. But we're just in a different world. And I think anybody, and all of you would understand that the complexity of sort of a 21st century geopolitical mess or complexity that we're in, it requires multiple stakeholders to be teaming to help chunk through, and if not solve, then manage, I think, the pretty significant problems that we have. I would say a couple of things. One is that Palantir, I feel like we're still getting used to being big. I mean, it's sort of a weird thing. We're sort of like, are we big? Or we're big compared to maybe you guys, but we're still, we see ourselves as a software prime. Fortunately, we had a great win with a number of partners on Titan as maybe the first software prime on a huge program. Like, that's super exciting. Can't believe in 2024 there's only been one. I mean, for all intents and purposes, but they exist now, and we get to be a part of that. We feel really powerfully about now being a part of this ecosystem that is helping shape it and providing opportunities to companies that are in less advanced stages. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to give one story, which you'll either find horrifying or I don't know, maybe just typical. We still have massive problems teaming, by the way, even though we've gotten better about it. And reach out actively and want to do it for the reasons I said.
Teaming up or teaming down, for lack of a better term?
Honestly, in some ways both, but we don't have an issue at all subbing. I mean, we're just sort of like, hey, let's jump in and jump on, and here's the thing that we can do that helps whatever the problem set is. I will not mention the prime by name, but about a year and a half ago, a couple of us, fairly senior folks in the company, met with a very senior person at a prime and said, wow, it's really great to be here, and this is so interesting, and you're an amazing brand, and we are really interested in exploring some things with you, and here are 5 or 6 ideas, right? And this person said, I'm really glad you reached out, and, not entirely sure what you all do or don't do, and there's some weird Lord of the Rings stuff going on in your company. But let's just talk a little bit about some of your ideas. And then at some point in the conversation, maybe 15 minutes or so through, this person said, are you talking to others? Like, are you talking to other primes? And, my colleagues and I kind of looked at each other like, that seems like an obvious question, but, whatever. And we looked over and we said, we are. And this person said, well, who? I mean, which, all of them, just a couple? And so we said, well, no, all of them. We think there's enough problem, or challenge sets in the world that we can each kind of find our own way of contributing something unique, right, technologically. And this person said, well, if you are doing that, then I don't really think we have anything else to talk about. And it was this stunning moment. This person was very nice. But this stunning moment from a very well-known, company about just not understanding at all kind of what I would say would be the world that we're actually living in, right? And so have a lot of those kinds of behaviors. I'm not trying to pick on the primes. We want them. We want to increase their rev. There are all kinds of things that we think we can do to increase the relevance of the primes. And of course, they're relevant and they're core to our industrial base, and we love that. But it was a really interesting, insightful moment into a particular way of thinking that is still lingering around.
Was that company's name sound like Lockheed Martin?
Absolutely not. Nope.
Should I just go down to all the companies? We won't do that. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left, and we have some questions that have come in. So I want to make sure that we get to as many of these as possible. So maybe we can try to keep the answers a little bit tight so we can make sure we try to get through here. One question that I thought was interesting, because Ukraine was brought up earlier. Somebody asked, unfortunately, I don't have your names here, but thank you for the question. What lessons have your companies learned from observing the situation in Ukraine? Has it informed your thinking on development of capabilities or how you're targeting? I'm going to phrase this a little bit differently than the question. Are you targeting your products in relation to that to the US government, or are you thinking more about targeting abroad? And maybe, Wendy, we can just start with you and go back down this way.
It's a great question. I appreciate you asking that. We've learned a lot from our engagement with Ukraine. Our co-founder and CEO, Alex Karp, was the first Western CEO to visit President Zelensky at the start of the war, very first. Basically to go in and say, we're here and we want to not come in and talk contract and money and all those things. We want to actually be responsive to what it is that your needs are right now from a warfighting perspective. Very proud of that. He didn't do it for kudos. He did it because that's the DNA of that dude and of our company. The one thing I would say, and by the way, whoever you are, I'm always happy to talk about our work in Ukraine, which has now been, as long as the war has been. I'll focus on one issue, which is that as we have tried to figure out how we continue to provide what we're providing from a warfighter perspective, it has been almost impossible to get paid by our own government. Now, we haven't gone in guns a-blazing, saying we demand this, we need that, and blah, blah, blah. That's never where the conversation started with us. It was never about profit. It's about being, part of a global community that is defending values that we see as critical to who we are in a functioning democracy and the rule of law, et cetera. That's still what it's about. It would also be nice after a period of time if you could go to your own department through the procurement process and through the letter of request process where the Ukrainians are saying, here are the things that we need, here are the things that, this kind of company has been providing, and we would like to let you know how important it is for us to have this capability. Would you please somehow put it, on your big prioritized list of capabilities that the department could potentially reimburse companies for? That hasn't happened once in years. And that has nothing to do with the Ukrainians. That's our system. It's very complicated, but one of the reasons that we have a system that is geared towards paying hardware companies. Granted, hardware is, the central component mostly of the war. That are massive software applications and capabilities that are also a central part of this war. I'm sure you've all read about it, and the Ukrainians are incredibly creative with how they have really helped develop out in the field and in the middle of war these different kinds of capabilities. But it is something that we have got to work on. Software is not a part of how this works, and I think is a real problem for the entire defense technology ecosystem moving forward.
Hugh?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'll say, first of all, I'm very impressed with what Palantir has done over in Ukraine. I have a good friend who's over there working on it. So I think being on the front lines of that is really, I can't understate how impactful that actually was. I would say just really quickly, so I was at that forum last week in Poland with the Ukrainian military. Two things stood out to me, actually very particularly. One is obviously the urgency of the problem. It's driving a huge amount of domestic innovation. And they move so quickly. There was a story out of Defense Acquisition University talking about how a lot of how they're solving like the MLOps at the edge problem is they're putting some civilian engineer out there with TensorFlow on a laptop and just creating models. It's like really cheap. It works, and they're really solving their own problems. I talked to another company that's scraping data via Telegram, labeling it with ChatGPT, and making object detection models. They have found incredibly innovative ways to get the data they need and to move quickly. The second, honestly, though, is just a funding problem. Was what was very clear there. So there was an investor speed dating component of it. There's a huge gap in funding to go after these things. So they have a goal of producing 1 million FPV drones this year. The biggest issue is funding to get to a lot of it. So I think both urgency. And last thing I'd say is just they're quite advanced on a number of autonomy projects as well. They've certified dozens and dozens of UGVs. They have many different UAV options over there. So it's a reminder, I think, to us on the US DoD side of Sometimes the problems are simpler than the solutions are simpler than you think they are, cheaper than you think they are. And it's a lot of just how do we unblock ourselves to move faster?
Yeah, I'll talk about it from two perspectives. As a small company, when we built AI technology, we would not sell directly to a different country. We would actually go through the U.S. government to sell it. It would have been it's far more straightforward. As part of Saab is a European company, and so a lot of the work they do is very closely linked with the war in Ukraine. So they directly sell. So it is really interesting to see a perspective of it from a European country. So I recently was in Sweden, and the way they talk about Ukraine is, the distance from Stockholm to the northern part of Sweden is farther than the distance from Stockholm to the border of Ukraine. So it is very, very much more visceral in Europe than we kind of feel here with an ocean across from us. So it is very, very interesting. I do think that, Saab being a European company is very much forward-leaning.
I'd be remiss if I didn't note that on breakingdefense.com this week we published a story from Ukraine where we had a reporter there who talked to a number of startups specifically about kind of how they're working things on the edge and coming up with new ideas on the fly. We have just about 3.5 minutes, so I'm going to ask one more question and maybe we can just kind of quickly go down the line. Getting back to kind of the original, I guess, focus of this and how to help and actually understand how to work better with the government. What's one best practice from industry that the government does not use but could realistically implement? And that last part I think is important because I'm sure we all have a million things that would make it easier, but those just aren't going to happen. David, do you want to start?
Wendy, do you want to start?
Not really, but I will. Please don't see this as like a lazy way out of this question. One of the things that I have found most helpful is having lots and lots and lots of informal conversations with all different kinds of stakeholders in government and actually, Palantir is better at doing than saying. For example, we have that, line, and we got to show rather than tell, because we can blah, 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 or PowerPoint our way through something, and it's exhausting, and actually none of it matters unless you know if your product works, right, and produces sort of outcomes. What I have found to be the best single way to engage people in government, despite all the things and the reforms and the this or that and the blah, blah that we've talked about, is, for example, to go see a PEO of a service and then figure out a way to get with that service acquisition executives team and then find a way to go to an acquisition and sustainment person who might be running the Defense Industrial Base office in OSD. And then maybe, talk through, an operator in that same service who maybe has had experience with the product. So it's a way of not only introducing yourself through showing what it is that you do, demoing, giving analogical demos that, for things that we've done with other agencies, giving them a sense of how they would use it, but then stitching together through those conversations a kind of alliance over time. I mean, that's for us where winning actually has come from, especially in recent years, as we've won some pretty, big things. I mean, Aaron, you guys just reported on the big, $480 million CDAO contract over 5 years. By the way, it's not just Palantir. It's Maven as a backbone of a system that welcomes, hopefully, dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of other software companies to participate. To me, that's the win. Like, yeah, we're excited about our win, huge. But there's a whole ecosystem it's inviting in that I hope people, understand that the CDAO under Rada Plum's leadership is doing. But I think that informal stitching together is hugely important. But nobody tells you to do that. Like, there's no playbook that says, go and figure out who else. But I can tell you personally that has resulted in a number of our opportunities over time that have allowed us to capture really significant, meaningful projects.
Hugh, real quick, anything you want to add?
Yeah, no. I think I would look at like what we call like the POC model in commercial, like this kind of like rapid trial thing. One thing that struck me immediately when I moved from commercial defense is actually how much less time I spend with the warfighter, which in the commercial is just like your end user. So for the first 2 years of my time at Applied, I was actually more focused on our automotive customers. And there you'd have a similar sort of first motion, which is you talk to someone who's kind of setting the direction, the budget, the timeline. But then after that, once they say, okay, let's try your product, we spend a lot less time with them. We spend a lot more time with the actual end users. And they say, go make it work with them. And that wasn't even necessarily specific to automotive. Part of why I work on off-road right now is because or defense is because we worked on a lot of the not defense, not automotive customers, people who are like trying to figure this out in forestry and other places. So I would love to see in defense when it comes to the acquisition path, how do you get more rapid technology into the hands of warfighters? It sounds a little trite, but really actually have technology companies sit down with them and say, come up with a solution this time and prove that it works.
Yeah, I know you can't give anything to the DoD for free, but the ability to do a quick POC for people to actually test the product, not just write a contract, respond to an RFI, but actually test the product. I think something that DIU did very early on, which was get a bunch of companies to pitch their wares. Honestly, like a Y Combinator kind of interview situation would also be useful. And then I also do commend Senator Schumer did the AI Executive Forum, and that turned into multiple bills. And so their team reached out to individuals to, in various areas to then start putting together bills on AI. I thought was extremely, extremely useful. So I think there's like 3 ways to go about doing it, but it's also already been done in various forms.